Hi, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in films, television, and in books. And this video is just going to be a sort of discussion of magic in fantasy, particularly the concepts of hard magic and soft magic, or hard magic systems and soft magic systems. And ultimately, why I think while they are useful descriptions, they are sometimes overused as a way of defining the story that you're reading. And sometimes they're not quite as useful in terms of describing the narrative as we might think. But also that while they describe different approaches to magic, it's not that one is better than the other. This, I think, at least, is more about describing a flavor or approach, something that might appeal to a personal taste. So, of course, hard magic, soft magic, this idea of a spectrum of approach to how magic is integrated into the story world is by analogy from how we describe science fiction. Um, One of the ways to describe science fiction, we talked about hard SF and soft SF, where hard SF was a mimetic reality, something very, very similar to our own understanding of the universe. There's no sound in space. You have parabolic arcs when you're flying through space, that it's not about straight lines everywhere. Gravity functions in a certain way. You take into account the distances, the vast distances between solar systems. Hal Clement's Mission to Gravity, I think, is one of the stories where he posited a world that had a huge or a much faster sort of rotational spin, which offset the fact that it was a very strong gravity on the world. So humans could only land at a certain point on the planet because that was where the gravity or the rotational spin offset the gravity to such an extent that we could function. But the natives of the planet who were super strong, but also super tiny because they were under this huge gravitational force. That is hard SF. It's playing with the rules of the universe as we understand them and creating really interesting narratives out of what the universe can give us. Soft SF, on the other hand, was obviously looking at space opera, where we can have these spaceships zipping past each other, making the noise of their engines. Think of the TIE fighter noise and the sound of the blasters in Star Wars. You know, sound doesn't function in space, but it's exciting. So space opera was using the universe as a narrative playground and then discarding rules or playing around with newfangled technologies or technologies that we don't think could even actually exist. But they did so to create an interesting narrative, to think about the possibilities of the universe. So they were going into very different directions, and they are very much different flavors of SF. And we might really enjoy some hard SF novels. We might really enjoy some soft SF novels. Greg Egan wrote a whole series of different books and short stories playing with different concepts about extrapolating what an AI means, an AI future, virtual personalities, playing with all of these concepts, quantum physics, quantum realities, all of these things we could class as hard SF because he was basing them very much on existing understandings of physics and computing and all of these scientific rational approaches. But he still creates interesting narratives that sometimes fudge the rules a bit. So hard SF and soft SF are very much a spectrum. And so that's kind of what got applied to magic in fantasy, because in some respects, magic in fantasy is very similar to technology in science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke's famous line, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But Raf did a really brilliant video on where sort of hard magic systems start entering into the fantasy genre, and he locates it in role-playing games. Go and watch Raf's video. It's absolutely brilliant. I'll Link it in the description below. And what we saw here was a movement away from magic as potentially ineffable, as Sir Terry Pratchett might have phrased it, unknowable, a supernatural or divine or metaphysical sort of thing, a sense of wonder, a sense of possibility that was out of the reach of the human characters to truly understand that these were vast cosmic forces or divine forces. And they added an element of mystery and awe and wonder to a text. And that's what, a lot of the fantasy authors were exploring. Lo and behold, we get the introduction of role-playing games where, yes, we want all of this awe, we want all of this wonder, we want all of this power, but we want it in a game. And if you're going to have a game, you have to have rules, because role-playing games and the computer game derivatives and this style of creating a programmable, repeatable experience requires that rules be used, so that you can't just have, oh, you're confronted by an army. Well, I wave my hand and magic defeats them. It kind of ruins the suspense. So Gygax and Orison, in creating D&D initially, modeled a lot of it very heavily on war games. And one of the things they did was they took the rules for a cannon, artillery, and they said, like, a cannonball being fired, it can travel this distance, it has an area of effect around it. Well, if we replace the word cannon with the word wizard and replace the model, and instead of cannonball, we use fireball, we can incorporate a wizard to do exactly the same thing. So initially, the formation of D&D, and by the way, I read this is very general and it's going back to the earliest parts of it, and it changed and developed and has gone in lots of different directions since then. But the initial conception of D&D was very much a war game, and it was about conflict, and therefore how they approached it was on the effect of magic. So you could adapt Arthur C. Clarke's phrase to the effect of any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So it's not the thing itself, it's the effect it creates. That's where focus suddenly shifted to that point. And perhaps a way of explaining this is, if you think of The Lord of the Rings and the One Ring, one of the most clearly recognizable magical symbols that's ever been created in the genre, what does the One Ring do? Well, it's the ring of power, and Sauron wants it. Okay, but what does it do? Well, it gives him power. Well, what power? We know it makes hobbits invisible. Does Sauron want to become invisible? No, but when he wears the ring, it's about power. Well, what? Does it give him the ability to create lightning, fireballs, fly? What? That isn't important to the Lord of the Rings. That what the ring can do when Sauron has it is absolutely unimportant in terms of the narrative being explored. Because what's important for Tolkien's novel, at least in my opinion, is that the ring represents power. Sauron wants the power. Yes, it has the effect on hobbits that they can turn invisible. It lengthens their lives. But other people, when they put it on, would have different abilities or access something. That's not important. It's the fact that the ring is symbolic of power. And that's because Tolkien's system of magic was this sort of divine soft magic system, where magic was part of a religious, divine, creative spirit, where magic was something beyond the knowledge and ken of mortal races. It was ill-defined, deliberately so, because that's not what the narrative was focusing on. But for a modern reader, if we had a ring of power in something, most modern fantasy readers would go, yeah, but what does it do? What are its powers? What is it like? Can I punch harder? Can I run faster? What does this one ring do? And that's why if you think of magical objects in D&D and these various role-playing games, the sword of sharpness +1, that it's sharper than ordinary swords, or the ring of fireballs, you can cast a fireball 5 times a day, that they all have effects associated with them. So it's not about the thing itself, it's about the effect that it causes. So why then do I think that hard magic, soft magic is not necessarily that useful? And it's because, number one, as a distinction, these things exist on a spectrum. Um, no system is absolutely 100% hard. And well, there maybe very few systems are absolutely 100% soft, because we routinely describe hard magic systems as having these clearly defined rules that the author is well aware of, that are clearly defined and communicated to the reader. And that's what makes it hard, that the narrative then focuses on how this system um, impacts the world. That when the characters are faced with a problem, the reader already knows the tools in the toolkit that that magic user has. They're wondering, how are they going to use their abilities to do this? And the author can't just wave their hand and say, oh, they have this other ability that I never told you about, because that seems lazy is a harsh way of describing it, but it seems that they a bit hand wavy for an author that has spent time setting up this complex system that has all of these possibilities, and a hard magic system allows the author to write against them. And it's very similar to what I was talking about in terms of limitations with technology and magic in fantasy worlds. When you have a limitation, yes, you can give someone great power, but if there's a limitation, it gives you something to write against. It gives the narrative a point at which there can be tension, because the power cannot do everything. It cannot solve every problem. And therefore, having limitations on it gives the author the ability to craft a situation in which the characters are in trouble. There's narrative tension created, and the reader is then wondering, how are they going to get out of this? And when you have a hard magic system, when it is explicitly revealed to the reader knows that you can't just wave your hand and they'll just magic their way out of it. That there can't be this sudden deus ex machina moment. And some readers really, really love that, because they are following along with the narrative. They're trying to solve the problem with the tools that they have been told about. And again, by analogy, think of the murder mysteries and the those sorts of police investigation stories, the detective stories, where the author feeds you the clues as you're going along. And as a reader, then you can try and work out the ending before the character does. And for some people, that is absolutely brilliant. That's what they really, really want. They want to be able to figure it all out. They want to be involved in the process that way. And it is very much a style of writing and a style of genre and reading that people really engage with. But alternatively, you also have within that genre these sorts of stories where, yeah, sure, the author feeds you this information. The author gives you all of those things, but the author withholds a bunch of information from you and reveals it suddenly at the end, and there was no possible way for you to have figured it out. Agatha Christie did this all the time. Hercule Poirot at the end would suddenly reveal 2 or 3 pieces of information that he had access to that were never revealed in the text. And you go, well, of course, if I'd known that, I could have figured it out. Because it wasn't, the point of the story was not necessarily to figure it out. The point of the story was to follow along with the detective as they are figuring it out. And we can see this sort of division within fantasy, within these different systems. Because if you think of a soft magic system, think of what soft magic does in terms of some of the rules aren't described. Maybe a lot of the rules aren't described, but you have a general sense that magic exists and a general sense that magic can do things. And when it is revealed in those moments, it is stunning and it is awesome and it is revelatory. And you have these moments as a reader where you sit back and go, I did not see that coming, because you couldn't have seen it coming. You couldn't have figured it out ahead of time. But they still give you that wonderful sense of satisfaction, that sense of awe, that sense of wonder. So it's not that hard magic is better than soft magic or soft magic is better than hard magic. They are different flavors of narrative within the fantasy genre. And because they exist on a spectrum, remember even that a hard magic system, think of it, the hardest magic system, or the person most famous for this would be, say, Brandon Sanderson. And if we take The Final Empire and the Mistborn trilogy as an example, Sanderson is very clear in laying out this is how the magic system works. This is what Allomancy can do. And you go, oh, hard magic system. And then Vin discovers a new power. And then a new thing is discovered. And then a new thing is discovered. And each time it sort of just escalates and gets added on. Now, I am not saying for a moment that Sanderson did not have all of that pre-designed before he started. But when we talk about hard magic systems, we keep referring to the fact that the reader is aware of the rules, the author has these rules and never breaks them. Because if you break a rule that you've made explicit, it can ruin the suspension of disbelief. It can harm a reader's investment in your story world, because you're going to break the rules whenever it's narratively convenient. Then why have the rules in the first place? But with Sanderson's Mistborn, we don't have all of the rules at the very beginning. We have the general rules, but then it turns out there's a whole lot of stuff that we didn't know. So in effect, what is the difference between that and a soft magic system where, with a bit of hand wavy, a new power is discovered? And you could say, oh, it's because Sanderson had designed it at the very, very beginning. You go, yeah, but the reader wasn't aware of that. So it's how it's been implemented. It might appear to be the hardest of hard magic systems, but how it's been implemented, Sanderson has softened the edges of it for narrative purposes, because it's important to have that ability to still surprise your reader, to still develop the system, to still add on additional things. Maybe a couple of years after writing Mistborn, it's like, I really should have added that in at the beginning, because that's a really good idea. That would be really interesting. Developing it after the fact, when you've created this very hard, concrete system, can look artificial. So a lot of very good authors hide some of the rules. They don't reveal all of them. And if they're not revealing the rules to the reader, doesn't that violate the whole concept of a hard magic system as it's routinely described? And I would say, no, it doesn't violate it, because the approach to it is on these effects. These effects are known. These effects are very much in the vein of a rational, scientific, this is part of the story world. This is part of that universe. And this is part of the physical reality of that world. Whereas with soft magic, quite often magic is something outside of the world. It is metaphysical. It is supernatural. It is unnatural. And while it is wrapped up into, yes, it exists in this world, it is not part of the physical reality. There's a distinction being made that it is something other. So I think even if an author doesn't reveal all of the rules about a hard magic system, it's still defining their approach. And I suppose one of the ways that we can kind of think about this is if you think of all those action movies where they have the gunfights, where guns never seem to run out of bullets. Like they fire thousands of rounds at each other. And then suddenly they will run out of bullets when the narrative demands that they do. And it's usually they've crept up behind someone or someone's crept up behind them, put the gun to their head and goes click. And it's, oh, no bullets. Oh my God. And then they pull their gun around and they go click. You go, that's the first time you guys have run out of bullets this entire film. You've been firing thousands of rounds and now they fail. And it is a dramatic moment in the narrative. But everyone watching it knows, yes, this, oh, look, they've run out of bullets. Isn't that convenient? That's not at all contrived because it hasn't happened before. And action movies are meant to be heavily mimetic. They're meant to be heavily, based in our reality, our physics, involving all of the rules of our world. And yet we accept that because of narrative purposes. That to me is a lot of what hard magic systems can do. In that, yes, they have all of these rules, they appear mimetic, but an author gets to bend the rules or disguise them or not reveal everything for dramatic effect, and they can be developed later on. Soft magic, on the other hand, there can be um, a an issue with if an author doesn't have a firm idea of limitations or a firm idea of how their magic is going to be incorporated. An author who's using a very soft magic system may be inclined to rely on magic as a narrative crutch when potentially they've written themselves into a corner or it's a difficult scene and they go, I just want out of this scene. And so they hand wavy magic and it gets used as a deus ex machina. Now, the one thing I will say here is that is not the fault of it being a soft magic system. That is, to my mind at least, the fault of the author not considering the situation and trying to find a way out of it, or laying the groundwork for that revelation earlier on in the narrative. Just because it's soft magic doesn't make it worse than hard magic. They're just different approaches. And to give you an example of this, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman wrote the Dragonlance Chronicles, the original trilogy in the Dragonlance world, part of the D&D franchise universe. And they developed it as a game. It was developed as a gaming system, a new campaign setting. And they play tested their initial campaign. And you can get a volume, an omnibus edition of that original trilogy as the annotated chronicles, where there are anecdotes and notes from Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman and some of the other playtesters, all the way through the narrative, that they have these little comments down the side talking about things that happened during the game, things that they were thinking about, things that they tried, where one of the players did something and that actually changed how they designed the universe. And it's absolutely fascinating because one of the things that gets revealed is when you read the start of the Dragonlance books, there's an early combat scene. And in it, Raistlin the Mage uses a bunch of spells. And Weiss and Hickman point out, if you're familiar with D&D rules, you know what level Mage Raistlin is, you know what spells he has left, you know which spells he's used, and you can actually guess the number and time and all of it. Because if you know the magic system that is in D&D, you know exactly everything about Raistlin's magical abilities. And you can even make a guess to the exact spells that he has left in reserve. Because something like D&D, those rules that are so explicit, so well defined, you can know them. Yes, they're paratextual, they're outside of the narrative. They're outside of that book even. But that is an incredibly well-defined system. And yet, how does magic really work in D&D? It's not really explained. The effects are explained. How do you achieve the effect is explained. But magic itself isn't particularly clear. So I would ask you, is the magic system in Dragonlance hard magic or soft magic? The rules are explicit. The rules are clearly defined. The narrative follows those rules exactly because it was a campaign. But the rules aren't defined in the text. They're defined in a different text. So is it a hard magic system because they're following the rules exactly? Or is it a soft magic system because the rules aren't defined to the reader? And that's part of my issue here is in one way you can define it as hard magic. In other ways you can say, no, it's soft magic. If you think of Ed Greenwood's Spellfire, he has a scene where, again, it's a Forgotten Realms. It's using all of the rules of D&D in the Forgotten Realms setting. And he has a young mage practicing sending out this fireball spell over and over again across a field. But that's not how spells work in the Forgotten Realms. That's not how magic works in the Forgotten Realms. It makes sense for the narrative because he's practicing this one spell over and over and over again because it's outside of his level. And he's trying to memorize it because it's the one spell that he needs. And he's been set to do this by the Archmage. But that completely violates the rules of D&D. At the same time, it makes absolutely perfect narrative sense. So do we see this as a violation of a hard magic system? Or do we see this as the blurring of the edges, moving the hard magic system towards soft magic? Or do we see it as implementing a magic system into the world so it makes narrative sense? And this is kind of where I wanted to go with this video. To me, regardless of the approach to magic in a fantasy world, if the author has thought about it sufficiently, is clear in their own mind about its limitations, what it can and can't do, is careful about its implementation, and has integrated it into the story world, then I really don't mind what philosophy they have used to create magic. Because one of the worst things for me as a reader is when someone creates a hard magic system and this is the philosophy, it has to follow these rules, and then they break it and it ruins my suspension of disbelief. That actually is more upsetting to me than when someone has very nebulous sort of strange soft magic and they use it as a deus ex machina. You go, well, it was still an awesome scene. I get less upset at that than I get at someone breaking the rules that they have established. So when it gets integrated into a narrative, that to me is the really persuasive thing. So if someone said, do you prefer hard magic systems or soft magic systems? You go, I don't have a preference. What I have a preference for is the good use of those systems. So if we think of Sanderson's Mistborn, the metal plates that are put into the ground at various distances to form almost like a road railway across the vast distances of the world, so that the Mistborn characters can basically fly in these very straight lines, almost like a monorail. You go, that to me is a brilliant integration of the magic system into the world. What I am less persuaded by is the fact that if you have all of these Mistborn characters, and yes, I know it's a rare talent, but there seem to be quite a few of them, and you have these characters that have one ability or another as well, why are so many people armed with metal weapons? Because that's one of the big things that the Mistborn can affect. And we have lots of other things that we can use to form weapons. Wood and stone being very obvious examples. Why isn't the armor made of a sort of boiled leather that's been soaked through with a resin or a glue to harden it? Because that would be almost as effective, particularly in multiple layers, or if it was very thick, made of multiple layers of this stuff, as plate or chain. Why would any of them wear metal armor or use metal weapons at all, ever, in that world, when the magical ability is so focused on the manipulation of that metal? And so for me, and by the way, this is not a criticism of Sanderson. That is a really interesting magic system. I think it has been implemented very well into the world, but that would be one of the stumbling blocks for me. Not everyone stumbles on that. And then when I think of the Malazan world has what a lot of people would describe as, oh, this is really soft magic. You're never told how magic works. Well, you're told an awful lot about how magic works. It was developed from, and also we know from paratextual information outside of the narrative. It was developed from D&D, adapted into GURPS, and then both Erickson and Esselmont used it very much as guidelines. They had ideas about limits. They had rules. They had different aspects to the different warrens to describe what kind of magic certain mages could use. But they were also aware that they were writing a narrative, and they weren't playing a game on the page, that this wasn't just a game world and writing out what happened, that this was a story and a world and a history that they were evolving. And they also, because they chose close, focalized third person perspectives that are very limited, a lot of the characters don't understand magic. In much the same way, if I was in a science fictional universe and someone went, explain quantum physics to me, and I'd go, quantum physics? It's all a bit quantum. Um, not every character is going to understand every aspect of magic, even if they live in a world where magic exists. I live in a world where quantum mechanics exists. I'm not going to be able to explain that to you. I live in a world and drive a car where the combustion engine exists. This is something I drive all the time. Do I have any idea how it works? Something to do with the fuel getting set on fire and exploding and moving pistons. That's about it. Limited character perspectives allow for the author to fudge the edges of it and never fully explain it to you. And I think one of the benefits of that in the Malazan world is that we have these awesome moments where even other characters are surprised by what magic can do. And that surprise, that awe, that sense of wonder gives an amazing flavor to the text. Whereas if it had been a very hard magic system, I would almost describe that flavor as very mechanical and metallic, that it was rigorous and ordered and structured. Whereas there's more of an organic feel to a lot of stuff that happens in Malazan. So I think the long and short of all of this, which is, too late now, hard magic and soft magic are different sort of philosophical approaches to what's going on. I think one of the big differences between the modern genre and the previous incarnations of fantasy is we're a lot more focused now on the effect of magic rather than what magic actually is. And it's about utilizing it either as a technology or a science, particularly in the hard magic systems, or trying to evoke a sense of wonder in soft magic systems. But ultimately, all fantasy seems to fall somewhere on a spectrum between them, because narratives will ask you to blur edges, narratives will ask you to take shortcuts, narratives will disguise some of the rules so they can be a revelation later on in the text. All of these things mean that the magic systems, when they are integrated into a reality, are just one more tool in the service of the author telling the story. So for me, if someone says that's a hard magic system or that's a soft magic system, it's a handy piece of information, but it is not going to be a defining characteristic of why I will or will not like a story. Because a hard magic system done well or a soft magic system done well, because the story is engaging, the world is engaging, and I'm enthused and immersed in it, doesn't matter. If a hard magic system is done badly, or a soft magic system is done badly, that's going to ruin the reading experience. So that's kind of my take on it. I don't know whether or not any of this is useful, but I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any points on this, I'm always happy to discuss it. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.